Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started and create an amazing precedent of starting on time. But that means we'll end on time today. So you will be out of here at 5:30, and I will stick to that so that if you have things to do, you know what's going on, and you know you can plan on being there. Thank you all for coming today. This is the Ryan Center's sponsored annual Constitution Day. I don't know if you're familiar that there's actually a federal law that requires educational institutions to celebrate in some way Constitution Day. Constitution Day is actually September 17th, 1787, or celebrated every year, the day that the men in Philadelphia signed the Constitution of the United States on the desk of George Washington, and the day that Franklin, as he watched Madison and James Wilson of Pennsylvania and Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania and Rutledge of South Carolina sign it, said, I've been looking at that chair that Washington, President Washington, President of the Convention, Washington, has been sitting in all these many months, since May 25th to September 17, 1787, and on the back of it is carved a sun on the horizon. And he said, in all this time I wondered, was that a rising sun or a setting sun? And now I have the pleasure to know it is a rising sun. My name is Colleen Sheehan. I'm director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good here at Villanova. And we've been in operation about 12 years. And every year we try to do something for the university and the law school to honor our commitment to Constitution Day. The Ryan Center welcomes students, undergrad and grad. We're devoted to the study of constitutional government, to understanding our rights and responsibilities as citizens, and also to questions of the common good and to liberal education in general. If you're interested at all in becoming part of our organization, and the students have a very active Wednesday night debating contemporary topics. You don't have to hold any particular point of view. You just have to be interested, wanting to talk about these things, wanting to think about them in a free and open conversation. See Jay over here. Jay, you want to stand up? Who's the student president of the Ryan Fellows. And he'll give you some information. And Austin, who's the new assistant director of the Ryan Center, has a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to get on our mailing list or is interested. You're welcome. We'd love to have you. We're fortunate today to have as our guest speaker Henry Olsen. Henry is an old and dear friend of mine, and I am thrilled to welcome him back to Villanova. He was here last year teaching a course on campaigns and elections in the honors program, compliments and hosted by Dr. Tom Smith, who's here with us today. And I actually want to give a special shout out to Tom and to Chris Daly, to Alan Pachenik, to Graham Gormley, some of our faculty associates who, I see James Wilson here, who have been just absolutely good citizens of the center and helping us promote the best education that we can in terms of thinking about civic issues at the Ryan Center. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Henry has worked in and commented on contemporary politics for many years. He's appeared in many prominent venues, such as the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, National Review, and I just saw him recently on Morning Joe. I can't wait to ask him what Joe Scarborough is really like. And in concordance with his talk, he has published an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I see we also have in our audience today a member of the editorial staff at the Inquirer, Kevin Ferris. In his commenting during the last election, Henry was among the few commentators to most accurately predict the outcome. I don't know if anybody predicted the outcome perfectly. And as you'll soon hear, his research focuses on how to address the electoral challenges facing modern American conservatism, and his most recent book, available for sale after the lecture, offers a fresh perspective on Reaganism and the Republican Party's relationship to the common man. So, Henry's going to talk today about Reagan and constitutionalism. His book in particular focuses on working class America and how they've been forgotten by the Republican Party. And that if the Republican Party wants to win any more elections, I hope I'm summarizing this correctly, they need to wake up to what real people are thinking and feeling, and the fact that their lives matter. After Henry's talk, Earl Baker and Charlie Giroux will offer responses. Senator Baker shares a keen insight into Reaganism through his work supporting Reagan's campaign in Pennsylvania in both 1980 and 84. Earl Baker is Senator Baker and also Dr. Baker. Served in the Pennsylvania Senate for many years, served as Republican chair, and is still involved very actively in all kinds of things in Pennsylvania politics. He's the author of Run to Win, a book on how to successfully run for state and local office. Dr. Baker now runs Earl Baker Consulting, which advocates for clients in the healthcare, information technology, and engineering fields. Mr. Charlie Giroux also began his career on Reagan's campaign staff and worked for Ronald Reagan for 25 years until helping with Reagan's funeral preparations. So, right to the end. Now, CEO of Quantum Communications over in Harrisburg, Charlie has been recognized as one of the top 10 political consultants and top 100 influencers in Pennsylvania. Charlie's also a graduate of a law school that you're familiar with called Villanova Law School, and we are very happy to have him back on campus. If you will join me in welcoming all three, and we'll have Henry speak, and then Senator Baker, and then Mr. Giroux, and then we'll stay plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. I'm used to having 20-year-olds come up to me, 25-year-olds come up to me now and call me sir, so I guess old friend is now official. But I'd like to talk about something older than me, and that's the Constitution. The Constitution is clearly something that all Americans revere, but it's particularly revered on the American right. It has been revered on the American right for nearly a century now, often because it is seen as a bulwark against what's seen on the right as a thrust towards unlimited national government. Calvin Coolidge wrote extensively about the Constitution in his memoirs. Opposition to the New Deal was centered often on constitutional grounds, and indeed, in that pre-Reagan era, the leading non-democratic citizens group was called Americans for Constitutional Action, in counterpoise to the liberal citizens group of the day, Americans for Democratic Action. So it's fitting that as we're talking about celebrating Constitution Day, which has become something that is celebrated often on the right, both the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute are doing events in Washington, D.C., among others, that we look at what the man who is most lionized by the modern American right, the former President Ronald Reagan, actually had to say and think about the Constitution. I think when we do that, and it's part of the ability to do this from my standpoint comes directly from the research that I undertook for the book, we'll find that Reagan was in many ways a conventional conservative in his view on the Constitution, both on its promise for what America life could be and also in the structures that it provided. But we'll find also that Reagan was unconventional in one very important way, and that is in his view of the citizens' relationship to the interpretation of the Constitution. That unlike many conservatives back in the 1950s, and unlike most libertarians, legal scholars today, Ronald Reagan ultimately believed that the Constitution was not a living document, but one whose interpretation rested in the hands of the people whom it protected, the average person who exercised their right to self-government through debate, deliberation, an election. I hope to at least provide a prima facie case for that over the next few minutes, and I'm sure it'll then be picked apart by the esteemed lawyers on my left and on my right. So Ronald Reagan, unbeknownst to many people, was actually started life as a Democrat. He was not only a Democrat, which he inherited in one sense from both of his parents, who were working class Democrats in small town in rural Illinois, but he was a fervent, radical, liberal Democrat. He called this time in his life in later years his hemophiliac liberal phase. And he was remembered as somebody when he went to Iowa to become a sports announcer who would follow politics and incessantly defend the New Deal against Republican critics, Iowa being a hotbed of conservative republicanism. When he went to Hollywood, he was known by his co-workers and his fellow stars as not simply engaging in idle chit-chat, but in talking about politics and the situation of the world with stats and statistics that bore the tears out of them. And after World War II, he campaigned ardently for not only the Democratic Party ticket, but for a time some of the most liberal elements of the Democratic Party coalition. He was somebody who fervently believed in the promise that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal brought that would bring dignity and hope to the American people who were ravaged by a Great Depression and emerged from World War II victorious. Even at this time, when many people on the left were disparaging the Constitution as an outdated document, many liberal intellectuals were arguing against its delegation of powers or its separation of powers, arguing it constrained the modern government or the modern executive from addressing modern needs. Ronald Reagan revered the Constitution. He was known to have read copies of the Constitution between takes on movie sets. He also, when he made his first visit to Washington, D.C. as part of a movie promotional tour in late 1940, his then wife and a friend, he prevailed upon them to go visit Mount Vernon so that he could see where George Washington lived. And he was so moved by it that his wife bought him a replica of George Washington's writing desk as a birthday gift. This is what you can do for your husband when you're both movie stars. So even when Reagan was a liberal, he was not a liberal of the sort who disparaged the Constitution or disparaged the structures that the Constitution placed on the government as something that was inimical to the platform of the Democratic Party. When Ronald Reagan became a conservative, he often said that he did not change his views so much as the Democratic Party had changed theirs. He would either say, depending on the audience, that I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me, or that my views aren't very much different from when I was a Democrat to how they are today. When he becomes a Republican, he starts to give what is known as the speech. After he is a movie star, becomes a television star, and he works for General Electric Corporation and is paid to give speeches all around the country at their plants. And is so popular that he becomes actually somebody who is paid to give speeches outside of the plants. He became what would now be considered to be a public intellectual. He gives speeches on what he saw as encroaching threats to American freedom. In those speeches, which became the formulation, the basis for his political philosophy, he established what he thought had gone wrong and what he thought ought to go right to set America back on its course. And I go into that in great detail in the book. But the topic here is the constitutionalism. And there's a couple of things that I want to remark on. Is that Reagan revered the Constitution as much in his new era as he did in his old clothes. Reagan would often talk about the ratification of the Constitution. And he told he might have believed was a true story, but was later criticized as an apocryphal story, that in the later days of the convention, there was people deciding whether or not to go ahead with it. Should we take this fatal step? And he says that there's a story he would repeat time and time again, that this man arose from the gallery to say, that it is your duty, sign this document, it is say to preserve American freedom, and that no one knew who this man was, and that he disappeared from sight. And Reagan argued that this was a sign that the Constitution was divinely inspired, not in the same way as the epistles, but that the Constitution, in the way that it enshrined American liberty, was in fact divine will working its way into public life, because he believed in his theology that God intended everyone to live with freedom and dignity. So this was a way that he would often talk about it, that the Constitution is not simply a document in the way the lawyers think about it, but it is the embodiment of the American spirit, that people are rulers of their own fate, that people have the right to pursue the life that they want and to pursue and to achieve a life of dignity. He located this in later life in the Declaration of Independence and talked about the Constitution as being its enshrinement. But for Reagan, the Constitution was first and foremost the manner by which what he called in other speeches, man's 6,000-year journey from the swamp to the stars, was enshrined in a document that gave hope that people could actually live the life that they had the integrity and nature to live, and that they had the right to live if they could organize themselves. What Reagan did not say in those early days was what many people on the right would say. What Reagan did not argue in those days was that the Constitution's grant of powers, either in Article 10, Amendment number 10 in the Bill of Rights, or in Article 1, the delegation of powers to the Congress, barred what had been done in the years after Franklin Roosevelt's election. This is, in fact, the argument of Barry Goldwater in his book, Conscience of a Conservative, which was in the pre-internet day, kind of the bright part of the era, a surprise multi-million bestseller that established populist conservatism as a political force. And Goldwater's argument starts with the constitutional argument that the Constitution binds the representatives, that there's no delegated grant to do these things like pass welfare programs or retirement programs or farm subsidies, and though consequently the people assembled together have no legitimacy to do these things that have been done under the name of progress since the election of Roosevelt. Reagan never makes that argument. He doesn't even explicitly address it. And in fact, throughout his entire political career, he never addresses that argument. Now, isn't that an interesting question? That one of the most prominent theories that have been present on the right since the formation of the modern right, one that retains force today in many law schools, particularly in the libertarian interpretation of the Constitution, is not only never supported, but never mentioned by the person considered to be the most conservative president of the last 80 years. What he does talk about, however, provides some insight into what he might have thought his constitutionalism to mean. Now, Reagan was not a lawyer. He was a college graduate. Now, he was a college graduate at a time when virtually no one went to college. That Ronald Reagan went to college during the beginning years of the Great Depression, at a time when tuition at Eureka College was $100 a semester. And he was one of only 5% of Americans who received a college degree. So it's not that he was uneducated, but he was not a lawyer, and he did not talk and think in lawyerly terms. But what Reagan did talk about when he talked about what was wrong with the government was of a government that had grown beyond the consent of the government. Reagan's constant theme, which he starts in the 1950s and continues throughout his life, is one of a government that no longer practices self-government. It's one that no longer listens to its people, no longer allows its people to rule themselves, both through overtaxation and overregulation, but also no longer allows them to rule itself through the elective process. That his argument was consistently that there are bureaucrats in Congress, bureaucrats who are passing things, bureaucrats who are proposing things, who are pushing and forcing the elected representatives in a direction that the people do not want to choose. He was fond in those early eras of counting visits. As a member of the Hollywood community, he would often go to Washington, D.C. and try to lobby on behalf of one thing or another. And congressmen would tell him that they often don't know what's in the bills, they're not powerful enough to override the wills of the bureaucrats, that often the bureaucrats, in effect, govern. And for Reagan, that was the ultimate problem, that the people assembled together were no longer in charge of their government. That the promise that the Constitution gave us, that one, we could live our lives free of unnecessary restraint, pursue lives of our own choosing, and also that we could govern our institutions collectively by ourselves through deliberation and through elections. Both of these promises were being violated. In lawyers' terms, that raises an interesting question. What do we do when a law is said to contravene a section of the Constitution? This is the way lawyers are trained to think about it. I'm a recovering lawyer myself. no matter how much I drink, cleanse my soul, I just can't remove the original stain and sin of having studied common law in 1988. But for lawyers, we are trained to think in terms of cases, and that means that political questions are put before the court to say, does this act of a legislature or a collective body, whether it is a city council or the Congress itself, contravene the provisions of the United States Constitution? And we are trained as lawyers to say that the ultimate arbiter in those disputes is the Supreme Court. Now, there's a great dispute between the jurists of the left and the jurists of the right as to what the obligation of a judge is in those circumstances. And this is something that Reagan had to deal with, not as governor, and not even really in his campaigns for president, but actually as president, when he was in charge of appointing justices to the Supreme Court. What he said at that time showed that he was clearly on the right in one aspect of this question. He believed in what was called original intent. He believed that the Constitution ought to be interpreted in light of the words on the document. He believed that the Constitution was binding on legislators, and he believed that judges ought not to overturn popularly elected statutes because they disagreed with the text and found a provision in the Constitution that they could justify what was actually political disagreement. Mainly his justices agreed with him, and his judges agreed with him, although in some key situations, many people on the right believe that some of the justices he appointed, in fact, departed from that in key and important cases after his departure, particularly on cases involving controversial social issues. Anthony Kennedy, the swing vote, in virtually every case involving the rights of same-sex attracted people, was a Reagan appointee and sided with the more progressive jurists in virtually every occasion, earning him enmity along the way. But nevertheless, Reagan himself was quite consistent in this. But at the same time, Reagan would always talk about the major provisions of the social legislation that had been passed over conservative opposition in the 1930s and continued to be either reapproved or extended in the years since as something that he's had no quarrel with. Reagan never denied Social Security. Reagan never said that it was unconstitutional to provide or pay for somebody's medical assistance from the federal government. He preferred it be done narrow and limited means. He always said that Social Security should only go for people who need it, and in fact he refused to take it because he was wealthy enough that he didn't need it. Medicare was something that he opposed, but he did not oppose it because it was unconstitutional. He did not oppose it because it was going to cost too much. He opposed it because he said there's only a small number of people who are truly poor enough who cannot afford needed medical care. And those people he wanted to help. And those people he supported an act called the Kerr-Mills Act that established a federal matching grant to states to provide programs to help these people pay for their medical aid. This is not something that a hard Article I restricted constitutionalist could ever have supported, because there's no section in Article I that explicitly grants Congress the right to tax one set of citizens to provide for the medical care of another, nor is there one which, without some degree of creativity, can be interpreted in such manner. In fact, the way it has been interpreted through the courts, again, to remove to lawyerly standards, is to say that after 16 or 17 sections granting specific powers, there's a clause that says Congress shall have the right to tax and spend in pursuit of these obligations or something. And all of these programs are justified under the tax and spend power, which is held not to be subsidiary to the previous 17 grants, but rather to be its own general broad category grant of power to the Congress at all, begging the question of, if that's true, why do you have the previous 17 clauses? But so how do we reconcile a Reagan who believed in originalism, who believed in a constitution, with somebody who believed ardently that the federal government had the competency and the power to act in ways that had been considered unconstitutional, or arguably would be considered unconstitutional, by people who shared the very reverence for the document that he proclaimed time and time again? I think the secret for that, the secret to resolve that conundrum, is to go back to what Reagan thought about self-government. That Reagan, time and time again, emphasized that the problem he had with government was not that it was doing things, but that it was doing things without the consent of the government. Reagan, unlike modern libertarian theorists, believed that democracy could work, that people who are free debate and freely come together could freely assemble and elect people to act on behalf of the common good. And he believed that so long as these things were being done by the people and in the people's best interest, I think in a lawyerly term, he would argue in favor of a presumption of constitutionality. This, in fact, is what Judge Bork, the last man he wanted to get on the Supreme Court, Tony Kennedy, was the person he adopted after Bork's nomination was rejected. This is, in fact, the sort of argument that Judge Bork made in his book, The Tempting of America, subsequent to his defeat, a book that was published in the early 1990s. But I think what it testifies to, in conclusion, is what Reagan's underlying political principle was. Ronald Reagan loved America because he believed that only in America were the people truly sovereign. That doesn't mean that they were truly sovereign because they could run their own lives, although that was an essential part of it. It did not mean they were truly sovereign because they could elect their own representatives, although that was part of it. It meant that they were truly sovereign because here, a person could be proud of what they had done. Here, a person could exercise all of their capacities in line with their abilities and live a life that they chose, not a life that was chosen by them. And in that sense, Reagan would have viewed, in fact, I think if Reagan had been a lawyer, he might have been able to argue more explicitly, that a judge who strikes down a collective decision of people to provide support for the weakest members of the community would be equally as in violation of that principle as a judge who strikes down death penalty statutes because he believes it contravenes the meaning of the Eighth Amendment, given what common morality in the populace, generally as he interprets it, has evolved since 1791. Ronald Reagan was a constitutionalist. Ronald Reagan was a conservative. And I think what Ronald Reagan's conservative constitutionalism does is call all of us, but particularly those of us on the right, to our first obligation, which is to persuade our fellow citizens about how to live a way of life. And that to rely on non-persuasive means, whether they be judges or something else, is something that ultimately causes damage to the key American fabric itself, whether or not the policy that we have in question at that particular time is something that we agree with.
Senator Baker.
I'm not an attorney, as Henry suggested.
I'm sorry for casting aspersions on your character.
Well, it's even worse. I'm a PhD, which my daughter says stands for piled high and deep. Let me just start off by saying that I think that Henry's thoughtfulness and research and the depth of his research are certainly striking features of not only the book, but also his comments today, the op-ed in the Inquirer, and pieces that he's written elsewhere. I'll start by saying that wartime leaders like Churchill and Reagan are often thought of in terms of their aggressive leadership in winning wars. Cold War, in the case of Ronald Reagan, World War II, in the case of Churchill, and they're often thought not to care so much about the economic welfare of their citizens. But that's true of neither of these gentlemen, even though that isn't always, when we think of the pugnacity of Winston Churchill. That Churchill is another issue, but I can certainly say that Henry's argument goes to show that Ronald Reagan could win the Cold War, but also have a compassion for the citizens in his country. When the piece was published in the Inquirer the other day, it said a nuance is needed for Ronald Reagan. So I'm going to say that my comments today are a nuance of a nuance in the interpretation that I wanted to provide. I think that I'll start by saying Constitution Day is a special day in our family because in 2087, on the 200th birthday of the Constitution, my family had a picture taken with President Reagan in Philadelphia when he came to celebrate the Constitution, and so we love that picture, and it's a great sight to see and to participate in something like that with the president. And when his biography, when his diaries came out, I thought, I'm going to look up that day, September 17th in 2087, and see what it said. And I thought it might say something like, I met with Earl Baker, chairman of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, to celebrate the Constitution. And it says, I met with some local politicians. But so I want to say that I think that Henry describes Reaganism very well. I think to some extent it's a caricature, but I think that's necessary for him to make the argument that he does. And I think that if we think of some of the things that that I think illustrate what Henry would say about Ronald Reagan, when he was in president, I looked up the spending and the debt compared to GDP. And as you might expect with Ronald Reagan, the spending as a percentage of GDP was essentially flat. But the national debt went from 25% of GDP to 40%. Now, later on, it ballooned hugely, so we won't go into that here. My point is that when I showed this to people and said, well, what do you think, why would he have increased the debt? And basically the response was, well, he had to do that to win the Cold War. So I think there's something to that, but it certainly shows that he was willing to incur debt even against what we might say would be a principle of Reaganism. I also think the earned income tax credit, we don't usually point to the fact that 50% of working Americans don't pay income taxes because President Reagan felt that there was a way to encourage people to work was to not tax those in the intermediate between those not paying taxes because they didn't have income and those who had higher income to pay. And I think that was I think that you could argue that everybody ought to pay something, even if it's a small percentage. But I think that earned income tax credit that results in those percentages is an example. Again, I was recently with Congressman Bob Walker, very conservative supporter of President Reagan, who said in 1986 he had to argue with President Reagan that he was willing to tax too much. So I thought that was kind of an interesting point from someone who was a very strong supporter of the president to say that he in that case was willing to compromise. But I think it makes a point that I'd like to put on the table, and that is that Ronald Reagan was an ideologue in the sense of having principles and having a philosophy. I don't use the term ideologue as a criticism. I think it means that he had a set of principles that he really believed in, and as Henry has pointed out, he read, he thought, here's my point. When he became governor and when he became president, he was functioning as a pragmatic politician. And pragmatic politicians, and I would have to say again, I'm not using the word pragmatic as a criticism. I think that I certainly have thought of myself in my public offices as having a philosophy that I'm trying to put into practice, but also to be elected, you have to be somewhat pragmatic in the sense that you can't fight every battle over every principle. And I think that Ronald Reagan, as governor and president, executives have to deal with legislators, and that means that sometimes you have to make changes that I wouldn't ascribe necessarily to a change in his ideology as much as the fact that he was functioning as a pragmatic politician. And if you remember in California when he said, I am going to oppose that tax increase and my feet are in concrete on it. And when he made a deal with the Democrats for the tax increase, the reporter said, well, what about, you said your feet were in concrete. And he said, don't you see it crumbling around my feet right now? So he was a pragmatic politician in addition to being having a strong philosophy. I think that one of the points I want to make about Henry's book, and some of what's in the book I'm commenting on that were not necessarily part of the talk today, but I think they tie into it. I think that Ronald Reagan today would probably support some things that we might think of as Reaganism, in the sense that we now have a $20 trillion debt, It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It just crossed that 20 trillion mark recently, and it's a reminder to us that we have that. And even though we can have deals between the president and Democratic leaders of Congress to ignore it for a few months, it is still there as a huge debt. I also think Medicaid is a good example of a program that started out to be something that Ronald Reagan would have supported, and that is for those in need who have to have health care. And yet today, Medicaid now, because it has been expanded under the previous administration, we have gone from the point where it used to be 1 in 12 Pennsylvanians was on Medicaid. 1 in 12. The figure now is 1 in 4. 1 in 4 Pennsylvanians is on Medicaid. The expansion of Medicaid, and particularly as the population of aged people increases, threatens our budgets both at the federal level and at the state level to increasingly push out other initiatives if we continue to have Medicaid at that rate. I'm not going to try to get into an argument here about Medicaid or how we deal with that, but simply to point out to say it is something that I think that Ronald Reagan would have approved of, is to preserve the essential program by making sure that it doesn't get overextended. I heard Newt Gingrich last week give these figures, and I think it's another example. The food stamp program, called SNAP, and food stamp program has expanded again considerably. In Maine, this is what former Speaker Gingrich said. In Maine, they added to the SNAP requirements that you had to seek work if you were able-bodied and did not have dependents. And for the 14,000 people who had previously qualified, 13,000 went off rolls when that work requirement was imposed. So it's an example that programs that are intended to help the people who are the needy, who need the safety net, as Henry points out about Ronald Reagan's belief in the social safety net, it can go too far. Finally, just a few comments. I think that Henry describes Reagan as a supporter of the New Deal. And certainly when he was, during that period himself, he was an active supporter of the New Deal. The New Deal, as it has survived, and as Henry points out, Social Security, workmen's or unemployment compensation, these were insurance programs that were instituted as part of the New Deal and that survive and have survived the Republican and Democratic administrations alike. But there was a lot more to the New Deal that went a lot further that I don't think Ronald Reagan today would necessarily have thought of. So I think that's a little nuance. Also, I think FDR was a hero to Ronald Reagan. He certainly was when he was in his liberal phase. But I think he continued to be a hero of Ronald Reagan when he became the conservative, because he knew that FDR was a leader. He came to the country and said, we need to take action. And I think that in that respect, Reagan and FDR are the two presidents of the 20th century who represent big changes in the swings of the electorate. And in the case of FDR, it was because he emphasized security. And there was aspects of that we have today that we value and that are part of the continuing, or as Henry calls it, the public New Deal. But then if we look at Ronald Reagan, he became the leading president for opportunity. And so, and I think Henry does discuss this well in his book. I won't try to go into detail. But these are two ends of the spectrum. Where do they come together? I think maybe you could say that FDR and Ronald Reagan were both at sort of midpoints along each half of that spectrum. So I think that the idea that he was a hero would be somewhat limited to the point of leadership and for the enduring programs, and not necessarily for everything that FDR and the original New Deal would have represented. Final thought about working class. One of the interesting things, and I'll tell you, Henry researches things so deeply that it is just, no one could keep up with him. He knows polling data, he knows demographic data. I heard Colleen today ask him a question about, I don't know, from 12 years ago, and he came up with the answer right away, just purely out of his memory from statistics. So very, very impressive, and I think it comes through so much in the book, and it's certainly, I admire that greatly in Henry's work. And we have some interesting emails back and forth when I ask him questions about this or that. But on class, on working class, I think it's very interesting at this time when people say, particularly in describing the Trump vote, the Trump vote is what put Trump over in states like Pennsylvania, is the working class. And I think that when we think of government programs for the safety net, often they are not for the working class. They are for those beneath that, the more permanent underclass, shall we say. And so often the people in the working class are very much against the programs that may help those in the underclass. And yet I think if the coalition that Henry thinks may eventually culminate between the business community and the working class, I think that is something that's going to have to be dealt with, because we certainly want to keep those social safety net programs, keeping them under control, as Henry points out in his book. Don't try to regulate people's lives, and don't waste money, and help the people who deserve it. So how that goes in the future, I think, will be a very, very interesting aspect of Henry's work as we see how it unfolds under the Trump regime, and to see if those voters are the same as the Reagan Democrats that he describes so well in the book.
Thank you, Dr. Baker.
Just a quick word of my background. As Professor Sheehan alluded, it began a long time ago with President Reagan. I began to work with Ronald Reagan when I was younger than most of you in this room. In fact, probably all of you. I was a sophomore in college when I was introduced to Ronald Reagan, then former governor of California. Reagan was thinking about running for president, and I was incredibly impressed by him, his vision for the country, and his personality, and he somehow took a shine to me, and it was a relationship that lasted for an awful long time, including, as Professor Sheehan said, right up through his funeral. I had an opportunity to spend a lot of time with Ronald Reagan through those years, and some quiet moments and some very public moments, and had an opportunity to spend time with him and his family in extremely private moments. And so I speak from a slightly different perspective. I'm not an academic. I don't pretend to be. My experience is much more on the ground and at a gut level. And I'm obviously very proud of my relationship with President Reagan and the Reagan family. But the thing of which I'm really, really proud is to be a loyal son of Villanova. So I thank you for mentioning the fact that I graduated from your law school here, and my old law school buddy Dennis McAndrews is here today, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I have known Henry Olsen for a long time, knew him in a previous incarnation when he was the president of the Commonwealth Foundation here in Pennsylvania, and worked pretty closely with him in those days. I've always admired and been a little bit jealous of his intellect, and in particular his encyclopedic knowledge of statistics and election outcomes and determinatives. And Professor Sheehan mentioned that he accurately predicted last year's election on a degree higher than virtually anybody in the country. And we're a good balance today, because I was on the opposite end of that scale. I had everything wrong last year. Everything that I believed about Donald Trump and his fortunes turned out to be exactly wrong. And so I'm happy to be here with you, Henry, and to see you again. I read your book with great interest, and I listened to your presentation, and I'm trying to meld the two very quickly, because I thought that the conversation today might go a little bit more towards the book itself rather than to the constitutional underpinnings of Ronald Reagan's personal philosophy. And I think it's important to note that Ronald Reagan had a core philosophy. I mean, that in and of itself may sound somewhat trite or sophomoric, but I think it really is very important in understanding the man, understanding his approaches, understanding his politics, understanding his administration, and ultimately understanding his legacy. Because I know that the pivot point for Dr. Olsen's book was the FDR administration, and I think back to the early days of the New Deal. And the fact of the matter was that FDR, for all the stuff that's been written about him subsequently as being the lion of liberalism and this Keynesian thinker, he really wasn't when he began it all. He came to Keynesianism and obviously propelled it forward Reagan came to supply-side economics. He wasn't a supply-sider originally. He came to that and continued that. But the fundamental difference, in my judgment, in terms of their administrations, and I think you saw it in two specific places, was that when he came into office, Roosevelt was really throwing anything he can against the wall to see what stuck. He had a much more Donald Trump approach than anything else. I mean, Trump doesn't have a real philosophical core. He's been a Democrat. He was a Reform Party guy. He's a Republican now. But I mean, it's very, very difficult to pin him down on any sort of basic philosophical underpinnings. And in the early days of FDR, I think you saw a little bit of that. And you saw the movement of Roosevelt in the 38 elections, where there was this, I guess you call it mini depression, for those of you that are economists, that had hit the country because Roosevelt had throttled back on some of the policies that had worked for him originally, and the Republicans took, I think, double their majority in that election. I think they had 88 seats and went to 170 plus.
Double their standing.
Double their standing.
Yeah,
double their standing. Yeah, certainly not their majority.
Right. Yeah.
Anything but a majority. And Roosevelt did a quick 360. I mean, he completely flipped it around the whole way. Reagan, when he was confronted with a midterm election that didn't go very well, including some very interesting examples here in Pennsylvania where Dick Thornburgh almost lost his re-election because of Reagan's misfortunes, he doubled down. He didn't say, well, gee, you know, we're not going to go that direction anymore. He really, because he had a strong core philosophy, said, let's go even stronger and even harder. And you know, thank God in my judgment that he did, because the country, I think, has been a whole lot better off for it. He was able to create a period of sustained economic growth, the likes of which we've never really seen before or since. And let me just say this with respect to the national debt, or I was kind of struck by your reference to the $20 trillion debt. Ronald Reagan was appalled at the fact that we had a $1 trillion debt during his term in office. Think about that. You know, 200 plus years for this nation to get to 1 trillion. And in the intervening period since Ronald Reagan's first election, we've gone from 1 to 20. I'm sure that he's rolling over in his grave thinking about that. That would be apoplectic to him were he still alive and involved in the political machinations of this day. But when we think about the Constitution and Ronald Reagan, I think it's important to note how he came about, what his love affair with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal was, and what the dissimilarities were between the times of FDR and the time post-1964, when Reagan really, on the national stage, gave the first of the speech and had his political coming out. Because there was a period there where, I know Henry knows a little bit about it, I'll be candid, I know very little about it, and I can't find much to read about it, which is that period in the 1950s, which really was the metamorphosis of Ronald Reagan politically, philosophically, and publicly. He went from being an FDR Democrat to being very much a Kennedy Democrat. And I guess if I were going to turn into a scholar, Henry, I would argue that Reagan is much more of a Kennedy Democrat, or would have been much more of a Kennedy Democrat today, or in his administration, than an FDR Democrat. I think in both philosophy, style, domestic and foreign approaches, Reagan was much more aligned with John F. Kennedy, if you had to pick somebody from the Democratic side of the aisle, than he was with FDR. Because with Franklin Roosevelt, I remember my grandfather once telling me that he voted for Roosevelt because he liked his foreign policy. He wasn't sure about his domestic policy. And with Reagan, I know that he was a strong advocate of the Roosevelt approach to the Nazis and to totalitarian regimes generally. He fought with them, and unabashedly so, against totalitarianism in any of its forms, but particularly against the Nazis and all that they represented. Domestically, Roosevelt's core, if you will, because I don't think he really had that strong of a core, but his domestic policy was evolving, and Reagan, I think, rolled with it for a while. What you didn't have, though, in those days was something that, in my judgment, was very important to the election of Ronald Reagan and to his appointments to the court and to his view of the Constitution, which were the social issues that Henry referenced earlier. He noted that Justice Kennedy, for example, has been a stalwart for gay marriage and LGBT issues, et cetera, on the court, something that the social conservatives of the 1980s and the Reagan era would not have been comfortable with at all, and have twisted around wondering why Anthony Kennedy has taken some of the positions that he did. But those issues weren't major factors in the 1930s. By the time you got to 1980, I think it's arguable that the social issues were one of the driving forces behind the election of Ronald Reagan. And the thing that was an interesting juxtaposition there was that they matched up well with traditional Democratic voters who tended to be ethnic, tended to be traditional Catholic, tended to be in urban enclaves where there was still a lot of social upheaval, and issues like abortion in particular in 1980 were driving forces for Reagan as he brought this fusionist approach that he had, centered around a populism that he, in many respects, not only exemplified, but is it fair to say he invented it? It probably isn't, but Ronald Reagan, I don't think you can view him historically without understanding the force of his personality. I said when I first met him, I was struck with his vision for the country because he had one. He wasn't this cowboy from the West who hadn't thought through anything. If you look back and realize that he wrote his first inaugural address himself, and all that that contained, this impressive manifesto for what he thought the country could be and the vision that he had for this nation, that was him. That was the core of Ronald Reagan. But beyond that, he had such an engaging personality. People loved him. I mean, the nation thought of him as their grandfather. I mean, you looked at the moments when we sought the leadership of a president. I'm often reminded of the famous Challenger speech, when you had this terrible national tragedy. And Ronald Reagan just kind of put his arm around all of us and said, we're in the same boat together. This is, you know, this tragedy will pass, but here's what we do in honoring those who gave their lives on that occasion, etc. I mean, he just had a way of wrapping his heart into ours and ours into his that's very rare. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt had that kind of personality. And I don't think you can ever divorce those things from a discussion of the successes or philosophical underpinnings or anything else of the men who have held that office. The personality aspects and their personal appeal was so important. And in Reagan's case, it was a populist appeal. He didn't come with a silver spoon in his mouth. Henry mentioned that he was a college graduate. That was probably the highest thing to which he aspired. And I'm sure that, you know, among his friends and the folks that he grew up with, he was a rarity, having graduated from college. He came from very, very humble beginnings. And he shared the frustrations and the pain of not being economically privileged that so many of those folks did. And he had this common connection that constantly drove him in his early days to FDR liberalism, but in his later days to Art Laffer conservatism economically. I think the difference was that while he and Roosevelt both wanted to help working people, they both had a heart for the working class, the folks that rolled up their sleeves and through the sweat of their brows and the muscles of their arms built this country. There was a difference in approach. And I don't think that you can escape the fact that Reagan believed that getting government off the backs of those people, he thought that government had overburdened them, principally through taxation, but also through regulation, and also through other intrusions into their personal lives and their personal decision-making. And as Henry mentioned, he had a real antipathy for unelected bureaucrats who had so much sway over the everyday lives of working Americans. But he also had a real concern over the tax policies of this country that he believed did hurt working people in dramatic ways. Senator Baker mentioned the fact that it was Ronald Reagan that allowed an awful lot of working families to not have to pay federal income taxes. And it was also Ronald Reagan that said, as JFK did, a rising tide lifts all boats. And if we cut the marginal rates of taxation, the rate at which the next dollar earned is taxed, it will create economic growth. And through that, bring in more revenue, even though tax rates have gone down. And it worked. He really believed that getting government out of the way and allowing the productive engines of free society and free people was the best way to go. And you saw that reflected in many of his judicial appointments, not necessarily the Supreme Court, but for all of you, remember that the most important judicial appointments that any president makes are in the federal courts. The Supreme Court appointments and nominations get all the attention. There's only 9 people on that court. They have overwhelming power, but consider the fact that they consider a handful of cases each course or each term, and the courts beneath them handle thousands and thousands of cases, each of which has direct bearing on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And Ronald Reagan recognized that, and he put into the federal judiciary folks that shared his view of the Constitution and shared his notion that, he said it so many times, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. That was one of the mantras of Ronald Reagan. And I will say this, Henry mentioned that at the core of Ronald Reagan's thinking was the notion that people are truly sovereign, and that that's reflected through the documents that this country rests on, not only the Declaration, but the Constitution as well. And I think it's important to reflect on that for a moment and just let that sink in. But I also think there was another thing that struck Ronald Reagan over and over, and that was that for the first time in constitutional fabric, we had directly stated in terms that everyone in the world could understand, and the thing that made the American Revolution a worldwide revolution rather than a little, dust up with the British, and the thing that sustained the thought of America was that we said that our rights do not come from the government. Our rights are not bestowed upon us by a potentate or by any Congress or any principality or any power. Our rights come from God, and they are to be protected by the institutions of government. And we give to the government certain powers to protect our inalienable, God-given rights. And Reagan wrote a lot about that, he thought about a lot of that. It permeated his views of, in my judgment, not only the Constitution, but the way that government should function broadly. Finally, let me just say this. In terms of that period that I mentioned a moment ago that we don't know a whole lot about, it's fascinating to me to think about Ronald Reagan in 1950. And I'll take that 10-year span that there's really, Henry, you're the scholar, there's relatively little written about it. I think there's 1 or 2 books.
Very little written about it, and there's very little writing from Reagan.
Right, not much at all. But in 1950, if you think back, Helen Douglas was a member of Congress in California, a very left-wing Democrat, ultimately defeated by Richard Nixon, who I think called her a communist, if I remember correctly, during the campaign.
He called her the Pink Lady.
The Pink Lady, close enough. Ronald Reagan was being groomed to take her seat as a Democrat. That's where his political thinking was, that's where his political philosophy was at that point. Fast forward 10 years, and you've got Ronald Reagan as a JFK Democrat, something very different than the model of 10 years before. And then just a couple of years past that, in 1964, he's on stage promoting the candidacy of Barry Goldwater for president in a time when Barry Goldwater was considered to be, even among many Republicans, way, way, way down the right wing of the political spectrum. And that was the coming out of Ronald Reagan, which ultimately led to another group of Californians saying, why don't you run for office here and become our governor? And the rest, as they say, is history. So I think that transformational aspect in those years is really worth thinking about and focusing on. But I can't get past the populist notions of Ronald Reagan. Let me just say this. One of my business partners is Ed Rollins, who was the architect of Ronald Reagan's 1984 re-election campaign, the most successful presidential campaign in history. And Ed was somebody that was and is adamant about the fact that if the Republican Party doesn't focus less on the country club and more on Main Street, its demise is right ahead of us. I mean, he has, from the very start, tried to fashion coalitions that went to the working class Reagan Democrats, as they were identified then and sometimes still are, that he not only thought were essential bedrocks of the nation, but also were politically the most important sector for Republicans to ultimately have success. And Reagan bought into that. There was no question about the fact that Reagan believed that from his core. It appealed to him on a very personal level, it appealed to him on a philosophical level, and it appealed to him on a political level. So Ronald Reagan was a man of conviction. He had a core philosophy. Earl Baker is correct. He was, in many respects, a pragmatic politician. I forget who it was that said, you know, I'm a man of principle. My first principle is flexibility. In many respects, that was Ronald Reagan, because although his rhetoric never went in that direction, he understood that the difference between the rhetorical flourishes for which he was so famous and the ability to govern a nation were distinctly different. And he made things work. He made things work for this country, he made things work for his philosophy, and he certainly made things work for his vision of the Constitution. And for that, I think we are all very grateful.
Before we go to Q&A, at which point you can ask questions of any of the panelists, I just want to ask you, are you students familiar with the Challenger incident that Mr. Giroux spoke of, or with Reagan's speech on that? Who's familiar with Reagan's speech on that? If you have a chance to Google it, it's very short. It's very much worth reading. Reagan talks about the courage and the pioneering spirit of the American people. And on this flight up, you know, there were some civilians, including a school teacher, and it barely got up in the air, I don't know how many seconds, and, you know, it exploded. And these are people who risked their lives to set out for new frontiers. And Reagan talked about those few surly bonds of earth that touch the face of God. You should read the speech. Questions, comments? Mr. McAndrews.
This is really a question for all three of the panels. Do you think if, as president, Ronald Reagan had been presented with the Grover Norquist tax pledge, he would have signed it as president?
My guess, Dennis, is that he would have encouraged members of Congress to sign it.
I don't think he would have, because I think he would have felt it limited him too much in his options.
No, I agree with both of them.
Do you think he would have encouraged others to sign?
Ronald Reagan was not for tax increases, but he was also not dead set against them in a religious, dogmatic manner. Reagan believed that taxes should be lower, but in fact, in his last major piece of domestic legislation, he pushed Congress to adopt a catastrophic health care bill for Medicare that was financed by tax increases for people who were wealthy seniors. So I think that demonstrates that even in the last year of his presidency, he was not dogmatically opposed to tax increases.
Can everybody hear okay? I'm going to go to a student and then I'm going to come back here. Yes?
Yes. Good afternoon. I remember you said towards the end that the Republican Party, if it continues...
Would you mind standing up
Oh,
so we can all hear a little bit better? Sorry about that.
Of course, of course. Towards the end, you said that the Republican Party, if it continues to focus more on the country clubs and less on publicity and getting themselves out there, that it'll essentially lead to their demise. When do you think? When do you personally, or I guess all three of you, when do you personally think that the Republican Party began to shy away from Reagan's principles on really listening to or paying attention more to the working class?
Well, that's basically what I've been writing about for the last 7 years, and it's the last 40-page chapter of my book. I think they started almost as soon as he left office. I think the right understood Reaganism as being a cookie-cutter formula of lower taxes, benign neglect of the welfare state, aggressive foreign policy and support for social issues, and they've tried to apply it ever since. They didn't get the deeper sense. And so consequently, until Donald Trump came along, there was nobody who was able to succeed in capturing the hearts and minds of that person, the person who ultimately decides American elections. And you see it over and over again, that the different factions of the Republican Party seem uniquely, in different ways, tone deaf to what these people want from government and force them into the Democratic Party.
I would agree in part and dissent in part from that opinion. I think that Henry is correct that the departure from the Reagan populism was unfortunately pretty immediate, and that there was this formulaic view of how to win elections, and they haven't, some of them still caught up to the fact that that's not the way you win elections. I would say two things, though, that might be slight dissents. One, I think there have been standard bearers or putative standard bearers or presumptive standard bearers or would-be standard bearers for the Republican Party that did get it. One that comes to mind was Jack Kemp. Jack had a populist notion. He was, out seeking minority support for the Reagan plan and ultimately for the Republican Party at times when folks thought that was a silly thing to do. And he was very aggressive about it. He came from, Buffalo, New York, and was a football player and had, strong ties to working class folks and understood politically what that meant, but also I think on a very personal level understood what that meant. Trump, to be very candid, I don't think is so much the polar opposite of those folks in terms of a populist appeal. I think Trump's appeal still befuddles me on a lot of different levels, but it was more star power and marquee value than a true populist understanding and approach. I know we can get into a long discussion and argument about that, but that's my view of the ascendancy of Trump in 2016. I'd love to hear yours.
Well, I think that I have a research project for somebody here or in the Ryan Center or perhaps for Henry himself, and that is to look at Pennsylvania and compare precinct by precinct the Reagan Democrats versus the Trump vote. I do know that, I'll give you an example. One out of every 4 Pennsylvanians lives in a rural area. Most of us are not aware of that. And just to make a point of it, is that we have more rural residents than any other state, and close behind us are Texas and North Carolina. So if you think of the fact that we have such a rural population, they're often overlooked because we're looked on as an industrial state, manufacturing state, et cetera, Rust Belt. But if you think of that fact and then think of what was it that led them to put in majorities in the western part of the state, in counties, some counties in the western part of the state, 80% for Trump. It really makes you, as a scholar, want to probe into that.
Historically Democratic counties.
Yes. I have a friend who lives in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, and I talked to her just before the election, and she said, we just had an interfaith service of Baptists, Lutherans, Catholics, and Methodists. Did I get that right? 4 different religious groups. We had an interfaith prayer service to pray for Trump's victory. This is in Elk County. And I thought if that brought people together in that setting, it's an example that something is reaching people in a traditional manufacturing small town in the middle of Pennsylvania to get together to pray for a Trump victory. That really made an impression on me.
Let me just mention one thing real quickly. I know we're running out of time here because you promised us to be better at 5:30, but we all spoke relatively short. The point about rural Pennsylvania that Earl makes, I think, is really worth considering for those of you that are here on the main line, perhaps raised in this area or focused in this area. I live in central Pennsylvania. 10 miles, less than 10 miles from my house is a county where, until just last year, in the entire county, there wasn't a single traffic light. I mean, this is the heart of Pennsylvania. And if I drive up the highway from my home north, I will drive past places that still have signs the size of that wall, literally, that say Trump, handmade, and all over that part of the state and down into the southwest corner where I spend a fair amount of time during the work week. All of these, you know, tempera paint on cardboard and spray paint on plywood signs are still there. And they dotted the landscape last fall. I've never seen anything like it. I really haven't. It was really unlike any political campaign I've ever seen in certain parts of the state.
I didn't see many of those signs here on the main line.
I didn't think you would.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I have two questions, and I got here a little bit late, so you may have addressed this. One, I've read in the past that President Reagan's conversion may have had something to do with his leadership, his presidency of the Screen Actors Guild, and his experience testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee. If you could comment on that one. Second question, again, you may have addressed this because this is a famous quote. If you could address his famous quote, I want to get this right, I didn't leave the Democrat Party left me.
Okay, so the first question is, in 1947, Reagan is involved in the Screen Actors Guild, and there's an attempt by what many believe to be a Communist Party led attempt to break and infiltrate the movie industry. And so Reagan is a liberal Democrat at that time, and he's involved in the union trying to mediate, because they're trying to get the Screen Actors Guild, this minor union that's fighting with another union, is trying to get the star actors on their side. And in the course of trying to mediate this dispute, what he learns from his fellow FDR liberals is that there are, in fact, communists in the SHE and in the group that they were working in who would not support this effort because they were more loyal to the Soviet Union. That for him, the key event happens on one night when Jimmy Roosevelt, the president's son, and Olivia de Havilland, the Oscar-winning actress, and others propose to him, make him, adopt this statement that we can talk about, but put in a statement affirming their loyalty and faith in the American Constitution. And a number of people refuse to do it. And Artie Shaw, the famous band leader of the 1930s and 40s, stands up and says the Soviet Constitution is superior to the American Constitution. So Reagan's scales fall from his eyes, and he becomes an ardent anti-communist. And in the course of this dispute, somebody calls his house and says, if you don't back down, you're never going to act again. We're going to throw acid in your face. So he's licensed to wear he packs heat for 6 months. He's licensed by the LA police to carry a gun so that he can protect himself. This does not move him to the left, to the right. Later in that year, he does testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee and gets some notoriety for that, but he remains an ardent Democrat. He testifies in a way that neither names names of communist conspirators, nor he says that the attempts to outlaw the Communist Party are wrong, because if you can outlaw the communists first, the Democrats and the Republicans come next. He does, however, become even more, he had always been an ardent anti-fascist, and he'd been opposed to communists. Now he becomes an ardent anti-communist. But he is the head of Hollywood for Truman Barkley the following year, in 1948. He supports Helen Hagan Douglas in her campaign against Richard Nixon in 1950. So this does not move him away. He is what was a popular and large contingent then. He is a firmly anti-communist, firmly pro-New Deal, mainstream Democrat after his experience, and he remains such for about another decade. So my book is a long exit. Basically, my book is a statement of what do you do if you take Ronald Reagan's statement serious, that I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And what the book shows is how that could be true. The reason he was a Democrat was not because of an ideological commitment to liberalism, or because he believed that America was fundamentally corrupt, which was, in fact, some of the motivation of the most extreme backers of Franklin Roosevelt. and remains a strong undercurrent on the progressive left today. He's rather somebody who believes in the American promise, but believes that the situation of life before the Great Depression and during the Great Depression means that the government needs to act to restore people to their to the promise that American life gives them. So what he comes to understand is that Franklin Roosevelt's intent set in motion events that were leading to the suppression of the very things he sought to protect. So when he moves to the right, he moves to the right in many ways, but he never abandons the love for the average person as his core belief. And he never abandons many of the key elements of Roosevelt's legacy, such as Social Security or unemployment, or the first, we now talk about welfare. Well, welfare was originally started as part of the Social Security Act. It's for widowed moms who have children at home. At a time when most people didn't have life insurance. It was meant to provide people who suddenly lose, in a time of sex discrimination and no life insurance. What's a mom with 3 kids going to do when the husband dies at the age of 36? Well, that was what was part of the Social Security Act. Reagan always supports these things. He supports these things when he turns to the right. He raises taxes as governor of California rather than cut too deeply into them. And he's very clear throughout his life that this aspect of Roosevelt's legacy he supports. And the argument I make in my book, of why I keep hitting on Franklin Roosevelt, is to this day, I was looking at a poll the other day. It was taken a few years ago. What do Americans think about presidents? Washington's popular. Most people don't know Polk from a hole in the ground. As you would expect, people have more opinions the closer you get to current day. Ronald Reagan is very popular. Not liked by Democrats, but still there's some people who like him. Franklin Roosevelt is very popular. There's not a lot of non-opinion on Franklin Roosevelt. But when I talk to conservative Republicans, that's what I always get the pushback. I always get the pushback. You can't be for Roosevelt. He can't possibly have been that person. And the argument I'm making is, don't look at the programs, look at the philosophy. That in chapter 1 of my book, I go into the constitutional argument between Hoover and Roosevelt. That Hoover argued that no matter how bad things are, we cannot have the federal government directly intervene in the economy by providing aid to people who are out of work, because that violates our national constitutional liberty. And Roosevelt said, you're putting the form ahead of the substance, that the form of government was meant to serve the substance of individual dignity and liberty, and that new means are needed to achieve old ends. On that question, Ronald Reagan was always with Franklin Roosevelt, and he never left him.
Let me just come back to the Screen Actors Guild for 1 second, though, because the defining period of Reagan's metamorphosis, in my judgment, was his time on the GE lecture circuit. And the Screen Actors Guild played a little bit of a role in all that, because he was one of theirs. He was largely out there as a what do you call him, Harry? A public
Intellectual.
Public intellectual. He was out there, on the speakers tour. Today, he's been pulling down, $350,000 a pop, but in those days he was making a living doing it. But there was this gradual shift there. His anti-communism, I think, became more fervent because of what he had seen in the hearings prior to that. But his inveighing against big government, which he did an awful lot of during the lecture circuit, was, I won't say welcome, but accepted during the Eisenhower administration, because you were campaigning largely against, or inveighing largely against a Republican administration. But as the Kennedy administration came into office, the Hollywood left and the Screen Actors Guild began a fairly consistent push to get Ronald Reagan out of that chair. And ultimately that was successful through a variety of different means, mechanisms, and occurrences. But the Screen Actors Guild, at least my understanding of what happened back then, was taking a position where Ronald Reagan was no longer the fair-haired boy, because he had moved dramatically to the quote-unquote right.
Yes, sir.
How would Reagan deal with what's going on today with divided government? He had divided government, was able to be fairly successful with it.
Reagan actually
previous
more divided
administration.
government because the Democrats controlled the House, and the Democrats controlled the Senate for the last 2 years of his career. Ronald Reagan was always willing to deal.
But previous administration and this administration is resorting to executive orders, which, in my opinion, is very unconstitutional. What's your opinion on that?
You know, Reagan was somebody who was a strong executive, but he was a constitutional executive. But what Reagan brought was an understanding that somebody in the other party is your adversary, not your enemy. And he was very principled. He would stick to his position if he didn't think he could make a good deal. But he was willing to make deals when he got something from it. And I think Democrats hated him, a lot of Democrats. We like to think that partisan animosity started in Clinton years. No, actually, partisan animosity is enduring. But, when Ronald Reagan was elected, he endured a lot of withering fire from the media and from the intellectuals or self-appointed intellectuals. It never dissuaded Reagan from willing to work with people who were willing to work fairly with him. He did raise taxes, broad-based taxes, although he refused to raise rates. In 1982, he overcame conservative opposition in order to make a bipartisan deal, and then he never did it again because he had been told that the Democrats had said, we will cut this X amount of government spending if you do this. And he didn't put it in the same bill, and he raised the taxes, and they didn't cut the spending. He would never countenance a deal on that again, because burned once, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And his advisors were pushing him to. That's something in his diary, is that advisors kept pushing him. They were afraid of the deficit. They kept pushing him to cut the deficit. And to raise taxes. And Ronald Reagan would refuse to, not only would he refuse to raise rates, which he even did in 1982, he refused to raise revenue in order to cut the budget deficit. One of the things you learn when you go back and do this research that I did is that Ronald Reagan was saying a lot of the things in the 1950s that people only started listening to in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan in the 1950s is calling for tax reform before Art Laffer has ever graduated from college. Ronald Reagan in the 1960s is talking about indexing tax brackets for inflation. When no one, everyone talked about it in the 80s during a period of high inflation. Here's this novel idea, index tax brackets. Well, Ronald Reagan was talking about it in 1961. So for Ronald Reagan, I think that he would have dealt with it in a way that was very principled, but but also very amenable if somebody is willing to come to the table and give him half or a quarter of a loaf of bread.
He was also very personal about it. And for example, Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, certainly a very partisan leader of the Democratic Party. Reagan would have him over to the White House and they would exchange their Irish stories and maybe have a drink together, and
Maybe.
and each of them knew that they weren't going to reach agreement on a lot of their political policy beliefs, but by establishing a personal relationship, that made it possible when there were things that could be done, then to follow through on that. And I think that it's interesting to watch President Trump now sort of going through this idea of how do you deal with the opposition, even though they're not the majority. Anyway, I think that Ronald Reagan proved that being personable had a big aspect of divided government.
And let me just chime in on that real quickly, because I think that was huge for Reagan. And he and O'Neill were not the bosom buddies that a lot of folks would like to believe these days, but they did have a very cordial relationship, and the Irish brogue that they shared, Dennis, didn't hurt. I think it was O'Neill that said, with Ron, and it's very interesting that he called him Ron, because nobody did, but he always referred to him that way. He said it was pistols at dawn and cigars at dusk. And that ability to reach out and, as Henry correctly pointed out, make deals, good old-fashioned political deals, worked really well for the country. And to the point that you made, sir, I think it would be a great academic exercise for somebody at the center to do, to go back and look at the number and scope of executive orders that Ronald Reagan issued, because I got to bet that they were nowhere near what we're doing today. And I agree with you, sir. I mean, that one of the things that we really have, got to confront in this nation is the use of executive orders and executive action to end run Congress and, accomplish public policy that the people of the United States haven't, through their elected representatives, determined. I agree with you. That's
one thing
constitutional and is a real potential downfall.
One thing I'd just like to throw out there, though, is that one thing that Reagan did not have to deal with, in fact, no one had to deal with until the Clinton administration, is the use of the filibuster as a partisan device. That there was no filibuster until 1917. It was passed in order to cut off debate because anti-World War I representatives were basically using unlimited debate to keep anything from happening. Go back to the Civil War, go back to the Compromise of 1850. Why is the Compromise of 1850 so crucial? It's so crucial because it's the first time that free states are in the majority. And that's why the South had to get the fugitive slave laws, because California was going to make the 16th free state, which meant that free states could outvote the slave states. Well, this should be of no concern to anybody in a world where you have partisan use of filibuster, because you'd still have 15 slave states. It shows that the idea of using it as basically enforcing a government of national unity was so alien to the American way of thinking that it wasn't even contemplated during the most morally fraught crisis our government has ever faced. The partisan filibuster is only a creation of the 90s and of recent years. And what it does is, I'm sure the Madison scholar will tell me exactly which Federalist paper he references, the Polish Diet. But there is one in which, when talking about why some things are a majority and some things are a supermajority, he references the experience of Poland, whose legislature is called the Diet, and it was passed, it had a policy of unanimity. And what happened was they fell into anarchy, basically, because they were unable to get unanimity, and that meant the country was divided up between Austria-Hungary and Russia and Prussia. The partisan filibuster in a two-party system is the same as the Polish Diet. It means the Polish Diet. It means you can only move forward with unanimity. And that is a framework for gridlock. And when inaction occurs as a result of gridlock, it is not unusual to expect a strong executive to step in. Do away with the partisan filibuster, and you'll see a lot more happening in this country.
We have time for one more question.
Well, it's not a question, it's a comment. Ronald Reagan issued 381 executive orders, which is over 100 more than Barack Obama.
Well, then I will ask the final question if you don't mind, but you only have, Henry, 3 minutes to respond.
Oh, is it to me or to everybody?
I'm going to ask it to you. This thing called the American Dream, Robert Frost
There's a
said,
student over here with the
I was
question.
actually going to say, Barack Obama, he issued more memorandums and did executive orders.
okay, let's get the facts on the table.
And there's a
As
student
my
back here.
husband sometimes says, I like to disagree with you, but you have all the facts on your side. So, okay, you go ahead and you ask the final question.
Okay. One thing that you, all three of you guys talked about was like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, kind of like entitlements, right? And I went to a debate at Hofstra, like a pre-debate for the election. It was with Stephen Hayes, probably someone you know closely at the National Review, and he was debating Lester Holt. And he was talking about how every time we talk about entitlement reform, every time it ever gets brought up in Congress, it kind of gets swept under the rug. And now, since you guys talked about, every time we talk about, Social Security reform kind of stopping its expansion, Medicaid stopping its expansion, gets swept under the rug. How do we kind of go along with entitlement reform in Congress now that Republicans have the presidency, the House, the Senate? How do we move forward with that instead of sweeping it under the rug like we've normally done?
I think the only way for a Republican Party that has been traditionally viewed as caring more about profits than about people is to put people first. And that means looking at it, reforming those programs with a view towards protecting the vulnerable and putting security as a higher value than cost. In each of those programs, people get things that they don't literally need. You know, that Warren Buffett gets a Social Security check, even though the $32,000 a year he gets is a rounding error in his weekly budget. And I think the Republican Party that wants to do it without Democratic support has to put that first, because otherwise they have no more legitimacy to touch the program at all.
10 seconds from just to give you a little bit different view on that. I don't disagree with Henry, but I think when the Republican Party now talks about cost, it has to be very personal. What it costs you and me to sustain a program that ultimately is unsustainable. The growth of entitlements costs everybody. The guy that's out there working his rear end off every day is paying more and more and more and more, and not allowed to spend that money on his family and their needs and their family budget, because those costs are going to support an entitlement system that's skyrocketing out of control.
So how about a free market solution? Sorry, a free market solution.
Yeah, but I think Henry's point is well made. I mean, if the focus is simply on economic costs in a very academic way, the Republicans lose. I mean, the people before that is important, but I'm saying that the way to put people before that is to say to the folks that are paying for it, which is everybody that's working, here's what it costs you. Here's what this system is going to do to you and your family and your budget and your ability to go to the shore next summer, or your ability to do this or that or the other thing. I think that putting it in those very personal terms and telling real life stories is what it's going to be about.
I do think that there is going to be an attempt at entitlement reform, but traditionally, historically, even Republicans, and I think Henry has pointed this out, have a hard time pulling back from benefits which have already been extended. They can fight against new ones and against expanding programs, but it's much harder to eliminate an existing entitlement because so many people specifically benefit from it. We don't have the time here to get into the whole entitlement issue, but I think it's an excellent point you're raising, and that is, how is it going to be dealt with? I think the answer will be some entitlements will begin to get so large that the debate will be what entitlements can we truly reform or even eliminate to favor the ones that have the broadest support or have the broadest need. That's a real quick way of putting it, but I think entitlement reform is not going to be lost with somebody like Ryan as Speaker. It's a big part of what he stands for, and even though President Trump has, I think during the campaign, said, don't worry about entitlements, I think the time will come when the budget itself forces us to bring about some form of entitlement reform.
I want to extend a special thanks to the Jack Miller Center for teaching American history and founding principles, and also the Villanova Center for Liberal Education, directed by Dr. John Duty, that I know somewhat, for co-sponsoring this. The provost of Villanova University, who has been very generous in his support of Constitution Day each year for a number of years now. We have copies of pocket constitutions outside provided by the Jack Miller Center. If you want to make sure you never leave home without a copy of the Constitution in case you're engaged in any debate, which you want to cite text. And we also will have just outside the room the table and some Henry's recent book that is available for purchase and for signing, if you would be so interested. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much